Today, the wealthiest person in the world, Mr. Elon Musk, who is now worth more than $400 billion, owns more wealth than the bottom 52% of American society. One person owns more wealth than the bottom 52% of American household. Rather extraordinary. The top 1% now owns more wealth than the bottom 93%. CEOs of large corporations now make about 350 times what their workers make. Unbelievably, according to the Rand Corporation, over the past 50 years, nearly $80 trillion, $80 trillion in wealth has been redistributed from the bottom 90% of the American people to the top 1%. So what we have seen is the very wealthiest people in America are becoming much richer, while at the same time, 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, and many millions of families are struggling to just put food on the table. That is the economic reality of today. So what does President Trump's Republican reconciliation bill do to address this grossly unfair and, in my view, unstable economic situation? What are they doing when the very rich are becoming much richer while working families struggle? Well, here's the answer. This legislation makes the rich and wealthy campaign contributors even richer while making life harder and more stressful for the working families of our country. This legislation provides massive tax break to the top 1% and large corporations and pays for these tax cuts by cutting Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act, nutrition, education, and other programs that are life and death for working families. Let me just give you one example of how outrageous this legislation is. As currently written, this bill provides a $235 billion tax break to the top 0.2% by increasing the estate tax exemption for couples to $30 million. I'm not talking about the top 2%. I'm talking about the top 0.2%. The estate tax is only applicable to the very wealthiest people in this country who inherit substantial sums of money from a relative. Under this provision in this reconciliation bill, a couple that inherits $30 million would now pay zero tax on that inheritance. Once again, this provision applies only to the top 0.2% of Americans, the very, very wealthiest people in this country, and people just coincidentally, I know, make massive campaign contributions to the Republican Party. Coincidence? No doubt. 99.8% of Americans would not benefit by one nickel under this top 0.2%, $235 billion tax. Further, President, this legislation would provide a $420 billion tax break to large, profitable corporations that are stashing their profit Cayman Islands and other offshore tax havens, and who, by the way, are replacing American workers with robots. They got a tax break throwing American workers out on the street, placing them with new technology. Bottom line, the tax provision in this reconciliation bill provide huge tax breaks to the people in our country who need it the least while doing great harm to ordinary. President, again, whether you're Democrat, Republican, or independent, you know that our current healthcare system is broken, it is dysfunctional, it is cruel, it is wildly expensive. Despite spending almost twice as much per capita on healthcare as any other major nation, some 85 million Americans are uninsured or underinsured, and we remain the only major country on earth that does not guarantee health care to all people as a human right. So, given that reality, the reality of a broken, wildly expensive health care system, how does this reconciliation bill address the health care crisis in America? Does it expand health care to more Americans and lower the number of uninsured? We've got 85 million right now. Does it lower that number? Does it take on the greed of the insurance companies, drug companies who make tens and tens of billions of dollars every single year by ripping off the people of our country? Is that what this reconciliation bill does? Not quite. What this legislation, in fact, does do is cut Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act by $715 billion, which the Congressional Budget Office has estimated would eliminate health insurance for 13 13.7 million Americans. In other words, this legislation makes a very bad situation in terms of our healthcare crisis catastrophically worse. If we were to pass this bill, the number of Americans who would be uninsured or underinsured would rise to almost 100 million Americans. In other words, instead of lowering the number of uninsured or underinsured people in this country, this bill greatly increases that number. But that's not all that this legislation does. This bill, for the first time, forces millions of Medicaid recipients who make as little as $16,000 a year to pay a copay of $35 each time they visit a doctor when they get sick, up to 5% of their annual, well, what will be the impact of that? According to a study from Yale University, some 68,000 Americans die every year because they don't go to a doctor on time. I don't know about you, Mr. President, but I have talked to doctors in Vermont and all over this country, and they tell me that patients walk in their door and they say to the patient, they say, well, why didn't you come in earlier when you first felt your symptoms? And what the patients will say is, well, I don't have any health insurance, or I can't afford the copayment, or I can't afford the deductible. The deductible hasn't kicked in yet, and I don't go. And some of these people walk into a doctor's office so sick that they die when that should not have been. Now, if you are making good salary, if you're making a couple of $100,000 a year, the odds are that a $35 copayment, which many people have, will not deter you from going to the doctor. You may not like it, but you fork over the $35 and you go to the doctor when you are sick. But Mr. President, if you are a low-income American, and if you're struggling to pay the rent, or you're struggling to buy food for your kids, or to pay for childcare, that $35 copay may be just too much. And the result is that you don't see the doctor when you should. President, throw almost 14 million Americans off of the health insurance they have. And when you force low-income people to pay a $35 copayment that they can't afford to pay, no one can deny that many thousand more Americans will die if this bill is signed. This bill is signed into law, are providing death sentence for many thousands of. That's just a simple reality, and nobody can deny it.